Thank you again, Bettina. Next up, my glasses are over here, I am over there. You know, afternoon day 2, I'm telling you, it's, okay. All right, next up, we have a panel I'm very excited about because it focuses on the underutilized, often underimagined part of the city that MAS has been invested in for many years, the East River waterfront. In the nearly a decade since MAS launched the Metropolitan Waterfront Alliance as an independent organization, we have been actively engaged on the future of the East River waterway as a major potential urban amenity. In 2011, when a new opportunity to re-envision the area around the UN was floated by the state legislature, we brought together landscape architects, community activists, and civic leaders for Design Charrette to sketch out visions for Waterside Pier, a former consolidated Edison site that stretches from 38th to 41st Streets along the East River. Today, both sides of the East River are undergoing major development, as we all know, and I look forward to hearing this panel's thoughts on the future of this New York nexus and landscape. Here to introduce the panel is MAS Director and Principal of Shop Architects, Vishaan Chakrabarti. My friend.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're very excited about this panel, and the basic theme of this panel is the idea that the East River, which used to be thought about as the edge of our city, is now increasingly becoming the center of our city. So much so that we needed this extraordinary panel of experts to talk about it. And I'm going to show a very quick series of slides that each panelist has brought, starting with one that I asked our office to make, and a slide that I found to be staggering. This is an image of the various proposals along the East River, about 47 million square feet of development, largely in Brooklyn and Queens. What you see superimposed in the red is the size of Central Park. Interestingly, Central Park has about 56 million square feet of development around it. So if you live around Central Park and think there shouldn't be new development along the East River, well, I would say that people in stone houses shouldn't throw glass. So based on that and that extraordinary shift that we're going to see on the river, we have this panel of experts who will talk about everything from amazing transportation ideas like the East River Skyway, the center of the center, which is the new Cornell Technion campus. I'm sorry, so the first was Dan Levy, who has proposed the East River Skyway, Andrew Winters, who joins as Director of Planning from Cornell Technion. And he shows 2 slides, one of Roosevelt Island versus Ile de la Cité, and the way in which, just a few bridges, what a difference a bridge makes. And then the great Helena Durst, who's here to talk about not only the Durst Organization's proposals along the East River, but their enormous, enormous interest in the ferry system along the East River. Keith O'Connor from Field Operations, who will talk not only about landscape architecture and design, but also about the way in which landscape will help mitigate the climate change issues associated with all of this development. And Michael Stern from JDS Development, who is building a number of projects, including the first project built after Superstorm Sandy of a large scale along the East River. And I just wanted to mention, even though Alex Garvin is not here, it would be improper to not give him the nod of the fact that he's been talking about the Brooklyn-Queens light rail along that corridor for many years. And I think it's important to acknowledge his visionary thinking in that. So we're going to leave this slide up here while we talk. And so I would say, just to start off the panel, that a number of interesting issues obtain. There is, of course, the de Blasio housing plan and the fact that the mayor has called for 80,000 new units of affordable housing. If you assume that it's 30%, that's 240,000 units. That's some 25 million square feet of development. So it's interesting to think about that in terms of this geography. There's the interesting question of whether, is this all housing or is it a mix of uses? Is it where people can live, work, and play? Does any of this make sense in light of climate change, sea level rise, and flooding? The transportation, what is the right kind of transportation? And then finally, what does this scale shift mean for these neighborhoods in terms of the change of neighborhood character in Brooklyn and Queens? So for that, I'm going to go to the panel, and I'm actually going to start with Andrew Winter. Should all of this be housing, given your role?
Should all of this be housing? Let me start by saying that I think that the city and development community has been very successful in creating parks and housing opportunities along the waterfront. And I think that over the last number of years, that's really been the most successful piece of what's happening on the waterfront. But I would argue, and certainly from the Cornell Tech perspective, that that's really not enough. That Cornell Tech and the opportunity to transform our economy through the increased use of technology and the growth of the tech community in New York City is vital to this, because one of the challenges along the East River waterfront has always been commercial development. Large-scale commercial development hasn't worked. It's been tried at Queens West. There was originally zoned 2 million square feet of development rights there. There's been some small commercial development, restaurants and that sort of thing. But with tech development, what we're seeing and what we're trying to support is a different kind of commercial development, different kinds of industries that are looking for office and maker-type space that's not Class A office space. And so when we look at the East River waterfront, we see wonderfully successful housing and parks. We see the opportunity to build this incredible campus on Roosevelt Island that we're doing, but we also see an opportunity for a real diversification of uses along the waterfront, in particular bringing commercial opportunities that really haven't been available before to the waterfront as part of the impact of the campus.
So based on, let me turn to Helena and Michael as the developers on the panel in terms of, I mean, does the commercial development that Andrew's talking about make economic sense for you? Or how do the economics of commercial versus housing work on the waterfront?
Start. I think beyond talking about economics, when talking about the viability of commercial on the waterfront, I think we have to start with transportation, and I think it's very fitting that we have the right panel to talk about transportation alternatives on the East River waterfront. The main reason that commercial development really doesn't work right now, at least on the Manhattan side, particularly on the East River, is a lack of transportation. If you put a 1 million square foot office building on First Avenue right now, how are office workers going to get to and from? I don't think it really is viable economically, but the reason it's not viable economically is because there aren't appropriate transportation options.
Right. So to jump right on that, I think we have to change our paradigm about commercial construction and commercial development. It's a different paradigm today. The tech commercial development is very different in that it's something like WeWorks. It's also relating to the studies that you've done, Vishaan, with 2040 housing, and that housing and commercial development or offices need to be much more integrated. Offices are becoming smaller. They're not becoming larger. So what we think of an anchor tenant like Coach or something like that, that's not the type of anchor tenant we're talking about. We're talking about an anchor tenant like WeWorks or Newhouse, where they're looking for lots of usage coming together.
And I think the proximity of the housing to the commercial space, as you say, really makes a lot of difference. We're not talking about large clusters of midtown Manhattan type office space. It's a very different paradigm. But I think it's something that the waterfront can really support. Just like you wouldn't build that 1 million square feet on the Manhattan side, you certainly wouldn't build it on the Queens side unless there's a kind of an infrastructure, not only the transportation, but the housing and the lifestyle things like the parks that you really want.
So, and in terms of that infrastructure, I mean, do you feel the need for more bridges from Roosevelt Island?
Now, I have no comment at this time, but I did show that image.
Andrew, it's just among us.
I think there's a need for more. I think there's a need for more connection. I definitely think there's a need for more connection. I think it can come in various different forms.
So, Keith, I'm going to ask you, actually, before you go into your landscape architecture, city planning hat at field operations, your previous hat at city planning, where Keith was very involved in a lot of the planning of Lower Manhattan. Do you feel like in order to address the kind of uses that Helena was just talking about, that you need zoning incentives or some other, I mean, do you need to prime the pump somehow in order to get these kinds of spaces that people seem to feel like we need on this waterfront?
I'm not sure. I think you may, but I think what actually is perhaps more important is finding a way, when there's an opportunity like this in this sort of extraordinary pipeline of development, is finding a way to have a truly sort of highly functional partnership in the public and the private. And it was, I mean, my focus was for a long time on Lower Manhattan, and I think one of the things that happened was because there was this amazing focus on the redevelopment of Lower Manhattan, that there was a vision from the mayor on down, and that all of the city agencies and entities were working together and were focused on making that happen. And I think something like this, where you've got an extraordinary set of challenges, right? There's a lot of new development online. There's the opportunity for housing. There's the opportunity for things like what Cornell is doing with the Technion campus, and frankly responding to the challenges of climate change, that it requires a kind of focus and collaboration, so that when there are interests in doing things that might be outside of the norm, that there's a supportive structure for that. So whether that's an incentive or more of a kind of focus on the opportunity and what's happening here to participate in a very supportive way, I do think some of that is really important.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about climate change. It would be great if everyone tried to address, I mean, does this make, we are seeing an extraordinary amount of development either being built or proposed in what used to be called Zone A in our most vulnerable flood area. How does this make sense? I mean, Michael, you've got one of the first buildings coming out of the ground that took on a lot of water, I think, during Sandy. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So we all have to design to the post-Sandy reality when we're designing buildings. And the fact is, we need to build in Zone A. We are in Zone A already. There's already some of the most densely populated areas of our city are in Zone A. And we feel we were actually fortunate that when we started our design process, it was right after Sandy, and we really got to think about it. We didn't have to retrofit it. It's really a true post-Sandy design. So we have a 30-foot high lobby that's designed to flood if all else fails. All of our mechanical spaces are 50 feet up in the air. And we actually have a full dry flood-proofing system. We have barriers that come out and give us 6 feet of flood protection. And if that 6 feet of flood protection fails, the basement's designed to flood. So there's redundancy after redundancy. And we're providing generator power to the entire building, convenience outlets in all the apartments. I think these things have to become the norm, but they shouldn't discourage us from developing in Zone A. I think we just have to develop responsibly in Zone A, and we're seeing the first of those designs come out now, and I think it can be done successfully.
Yeah, I agree with that. We're taking a similar approach. Either you abandon the whole area or you try to be smart about it. And so raising up the level of the grade, allowing certain things to flood, because that may happen, but making sure that your key infrastructure is not within that zone is critical. So we're doing that too.
Well, I think on that point, I mean, I do think that's what's, again, at least from our perspective as landscape architects looking at it, it is what's exciting about the prospect is doing innovative things. The landscape tends to be that portion of the development that actually can handle the inundation, can actually be great, beautiful, occupiable, transformative as part of it, while serving as part of that natural system. So as long as the critical infrastructure is taken care of, I don't think we need to retreat from the waterfront. I don't think we need to pursue hard, strict boundaries. We just need to be working in a performative way that responds to the conditions that we know are coming.
So to echo that, I like the term handling inundation. So it's not being afraid of the water or trying to keep the water out, but ensuring that your development is above grade. So we're all doing these similar things at Hallett's Point as well. But talking on the ferry side, ferries have always been part of the resiliency, redundancy for transportation. So you had seen the New York Waterway photo of the New York Waterway boats on the side of the Hudson River Park. That was after 9/11. The 9/11 boat lift transported over 500,000 people. And time again, we've seen ferries be part of the resiliency and redundancy networks. So most recently, after Superstorm Sandy, we had additional ferry networks that were opened because of the damage that happened to the subways. And so that resulted in ferry transportation to Rockaway, Staten Island, as well as additional transportation to the western side of Brooklyn and Queens and New Jersey. So I just, again, want to point out how important ferries are, because there are no other transportation networks that you can deploy as quickly as you can as ferries.
And so, Dan, just that leaves you in terms of your stuff seems pretty safe from flooding, but I mean, there's also winds and other things. Why don't you you should take a minute to actually describe what it is that you're so enthusiastic about here.
Absolutely, thank you. So the East River Skyway, for those of you who might actually be skiers, it's actually effectively a ski lift and a high-speed gondola. And one of the fascinating things about this map is if you look at basically the Williamsburg Bridge all the way up to the Queens border, that whole area is actually served by a single subway stop. And that subway stop happens to be, of course, the Bedford L stop, which happens to be one of the most crowded subway stations in the entire city. Whereas if you look at the perimeter of Central Park, I think there's probably on the order of about 18 to 20 subway stations that serve the Central Park area. So the Bedford Avenue L is obviously already completely congested and overcrowded. And the idea of building an additional subway line into the city, or an additional bridge, or at least a substantial bridge that would really cross the East River, both of those ideas are relatively unrealistic. And so I think one of the key challenges in realizing this vision of all of this new development is first of all, how do you get people across the river into Manhattan? Because so many of those people, of course, need to work in Manhattan or otherwise commute to Manhattan. And then secondly, how do you get people north and south from Queens down through Brooklyn and ultimately all the way through to the Navy Yard and Dumbo, and maybe even swing back to the South Street Seaport on the Manhattan side? And given the challenges associated with doing a major infrastructure project, a system like a aerial gondola would solve that problem relatively easily. It'd be extremely cost effective and incidentally completely resilient in terms of weather and climate change. When Sandy came, the Roosevelt Island tram was actually the first piece of public transportation to come back online. Similarly, when there was that big blizzard, either last winter or the winter before, the tram was the first piece of public transportation to come back online. And given that it is effectively a ski lift, any conditions, throw wind at it, throw snow at it, doesn't really matter. It's going to go across the river without skipping a beat. So that's the project.
So does it compete with the ferries, or are they compatible with each other? How do you guys both view it? I mean, I'm
I just have to speak up. I feel like you completely ignored the ferry network currently in place that's operating at about $3 million capital operating fee to the city, and a less than $1 million infrastructure cost for each of the ferry docks.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of ferries.
And secondarily, that it was the East River Ferry was actually in operation immediately after Superstorm Sandy, and we have the benefit of we rely on fuel and having our own fuel reserves, so we're not dependent on the grid.
Sure. Again, I'm a huge fan of the ferries. I think they're tremendous.
Sorry, I wear my heart on my sleeve.
I don't think you can throw enough ferries. I don't think you can throw enough gondolas at this particular problem, to be fair. I think the need to get across the river and from north to south along the river, assuming even some portion of all of this development actually happens, that need it just increases with every passing year. So I think the ferries are a tremendous resource. They're very effective in some respects, and the gondola would be very complementary. You can envision people on certain days wanting to take the gondola. It's middle of January, it's snowing out, might be a little bit more appropriate for the gondola, whereas maybe not the best day for the ferry. And and one other key thing about the gondola that I do think is a big distinction is that what's really interesting is that not only does it cross the river, but you can keep on going, and that's particularly important on the Manhattan side because, I think one of the challenges with the ferry is simply that it drops people off on the FDR, at least, of course, on the East River. So if you want to then connect to the subway system, which most people are going to want to do, at least commuters, they have an additional, whatever that might be, 10, 15, 20-minute walk, whereas the gondola, it goes over the river, it goes over buildings, it goes over whatever it wants to go over. So the idea would be to go
like
fairly...
Superman.
Yeah, go fairly, deep into Manhattan, at least on Delancey Street potentially, and connect directly to the subway system.
But I have to say, I think one of the things that this map shows is that if we collectively are successful in this amount of development, you might actually then turn the map on its side and look at the west side subways, the east side subways, and then the East River waterfront as a destination by itself, right? So that the transportation network in some sense helps to develop its own density. And so the edge becomes the destination. I think the challenge, what you're talking about, getting to the Manhattan side and getting inland in order to get to your destination, the success of this plan is that you will be at your destination when you're at the edge. And that's where I think the ferry and whatever other network of transportation comes along really makes a third vertical connection through the city.
So I think this is a very important focus point, actually, because I agree with everything you said except that it's a plan, right? It's not a plan. It's a happenstance, actually, and I think it's a happenstance that comes out of a couple of different things. I mean, I'm being a little facetious because obviously there's the Greenpoint Williamsburg rezoning, a lot of the planning around Queens West and Long Island City. So there has been planning done. I'm not saying that, but it is interesting if we think about why is it all of this housing is happening there. I mean, Dan mentioned the Bedford L stop. I mean, you would think that actually a lot of the density would happen a few blocks in where the subways are. But of course, it's not for a couple of reasons. It's industrial land, most of it, that's empty. But also in terms of neighborhood character, most people wouldn't want that level of density right near those subway stops that are inland a few blocks in Brooklyn and Queens. And so, hence you get all this development proposal right along the water. And so, just in terms of going back a bit to the de Blasio housing plan, is this, I mean, we've seen a few things come out of the administration in terms of East New York and a couple of other geographies that have been mentioned for the affordable housing. I mean, Michael, because you do a good bit of this in terms of rental housing, do you, and also what you're dealing with in Astoria, Helena, I mean, do you see this as a critical piece of the puzzle in terms of the affordability plan?
I see it as a critical piece, but I think that the administration's policies have a much broader effect than just this one area. I mean, I think as an example at the First Avenue development we're talking about here, which is right on a ferry stop, which is the main reason we chose that spot. You know, we're doing an elective inclusionary housing project there. It's 80-20 rental, and I can tell you, and you know because you're the architect on the project, the process.
We have a couple of projects along there, which is about as subtle as my suit, as you can tell. Right. But anyway, keep going.
You know, the process. So we were electively participating in a program to provide inclusionary, and it was a year of pain to get that inclusionary housing approved. So I think that the process needs to be streamlined generally. I think the administration needs to tackle how difficult it is to develop affordable housing in mixed income developments generally in order to solve this problem, and that's an issue that's beyond this one corridor. But I think it could be an important piece of the puzzle, but they have broader issues to tackle too.
Right. And so, Helena, you're obviously dealing with this further to the north. Further
to the north, and but the entire waterfront is a crucial part of the puzzle. I think that it's important to also note that there is a huge amount of development coming online. There's greater than 100,000 new residential units currently in the pipeline. And so this shows a portion of those apartments and an important fabric to New York City. What makes New York City so fantastic is that you have a neighbor who makes 100,000 and you have a neighbor who makes 50,000. Obviously those are not today's standards, but it shows a diversity of mixed incomes within that. And so you're seeing that diversity happening along the waterfront, and what the waterfront brings is similar to Central Park, it brings a quality of life that is being created. There's additional recreation, there's additional transportation, and it creates a better quality of life for all of New York City. So further developing it is creating more recreational, more open air opportunities, and just more opportunity for New York City as a whole.
I'll just add that there doesn't seem to be a lot of confidence on this panel that the Second Avenue subway is going to materialize anytime soon, because it's something we haven't talked about.
It'll happen. Well, what about the light rail, though? Speaking, I want to, right? Because why not have them fight with the gondolas and the ferries too? No, that's completely facetious. I really want to give Alex his due because Alex Garvin has been talking about this for years, and now we're actually seeing a template for why a light rail system like that could make sense. I mean, what difference would it make in terms of how any of you think about the development on this corridor?
Well, I think it all makes a lot of sense. It's obvious that we need a lot more transportation. What doesn't make a lot of sense is the policies and agencies that are currently working on these ideas. So I hate to speak poorly of anybody, but there's a lot of different agencies as it relates to ferries that oversee us. So there's DOT, there's EDC, there's DEC, there's Army Corps of Engineers, the United States Coast Guard. There's obviously a plethora of agencies that I have to oversee, and those agencies are then infighting for funding. And what we need is a coherent plan, as well as a waterfront commission, perhaps focused specifically on transportation, to make these ideas work. I really am enamored by the idea of a gondola, but I'm concerned about how are you going to find a place to put your stanchions? That means you have to go to a private landowner to convince them to put your stanchions someplace, your piling someplace. I have these same problems in just trying to find a place to dock. They're not all owned by the city. They're owned by multiple operators and landlords, and it's just a very difficult environment to work in because there's no conducive way for pricing and there's no conducive way for operating funds. Is that?
Yeah, so I just want Keith to pick up on that because I think in addition to those concerns that you just raised about the land, there's also this question of soft edges and building out into the, I mean, do we have, in terms of the regulatory kind of linguini that Helena was just describing, I mean, in terms of building the kind of edge we need, Keith, I mean, how much of a regulatory challenge is that?
Well, I do think I think we're on the cusp of a change because I think there's a recognition, right? One of the fascinating things that happened post-Sandy is I think the broader sort of public awareness of was the sentiment of saying we could have never imagined that this would happen. But yet there's a big group of people in the industry who actually knew exactly what was going to happen, that it was going to happen, and predicted with phenomenal accuracy that the subways would flood, that the tunnels would flood, exactly what would happen. And so I think from a landscape perspective and from a regulatory perspective, what's really important is to take the perspective moving forward. There's a lot of new development. It's going to happen. There's a market, there's zoning, there's demand, and to be super intelligent about the performance. So not just falling back on, these have been our rules. I mean, Andrew will remember very well, we worked from the city side on trying to build the East River waterfront esplanade. And for connectivity, for safety, for bicycles and pedestrians, we needed to go a little bit over the water. And there's a policy out there that says no new overwater coverage.
Right.
But isn't actually cognizant of, does that have an actual detrimental impact? So I think a regulatory regime that says it's performance-based. We're working on a project right now in Seattle where we're actually doing things, we're adding overwater coverage at the edge, but we're enhancing the quality of the habitat for migrating salmon. We're actually enhancing it. So I think the performance base from a flood mitigation perspective, from actually having accessible, right? It's interesting that the development here, in many cases, is actually going to increase access to the public water, to the waterfront,
right,
that doesn't currently exist. So I think it's a dramatic shift. But I think we've got an amazing opportunity because everyone's aware of it now, and all of this is coming.
Are you optimistic that we can change the regulatory structure to make it more performative, as you say?
I'm optimistic, but I think by our nature we're optimistic. I think not only because there is this broader recognition, because there's this impetus, there's this push, and because there's starting to be really, really good examples out there. Whether it's Cornell Tech and what they're doing with all of the innovative stormwater management things, or some of the enlightened developers who are saying we're going to develop in a particular kind of way. I think as soon as you start to get those examples on the ground, it helps. I think the difficulty is what Michael talked about, is that even when you're trying to do the right thing and enhance that the pain and suffering that you're forced to go through, it's not a pleasant thing.
I think there's also some catch up on the regulatory side in terms of zoning. Right now, as an example, there are still situations where the smart thing to do is put a generator on a roof, and it's not a permitted obstruction in zoning. So there's also conflict between FDNY rules about fuel storage and sort of what makes sense in the riverfront area, and that hasn't been addressed yet. So there's still regulatory catch-up there as well.
I'll just say one quick thing. I think one of the reasons that we all want to be on the river is because of all the environmental protections that have been put in place. But I agree with Keith very much that there does need to be a performative-based analysis. So one more quick point. I know we're running out of time, but I think the north-south connection, go back to this idea of an inland type of transportation. I think New York's transportation system has historically been a sort of a hub and spoke, with Manhattan being a hub and everything else coming into it. And I think Alex and I had the great good fortune to work with him for many years on different projects, not this one, but that idea of connection between Brooklyn and Queens that really ties that side of the river together and allows people to communicate without going through Manhattan, I think is the future.
And that's the perfect note to end on. Because it's very true. The trend is really moving away from that hub and spoke mentality about the city, and that this edge actually forms a new set of nodes where people live, work, and play. And I think that Hamburg is doing that, Rotterdam is doing that. They're doing it in a way that's sensitive to climate change. And so this can be a very smart future for us. I want to thank the panel. It was a great discussion, and we're going to move on. Thank you very much.